Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for logging into today's session. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. Today's the fourth session in our Ready to Rebound series, and while the coronavirus has dramatically affected the opportunities for people-to-people engagement between Australia and China, this series aims to focus on how businesses can use this downtime in getting skilled up and better prepared for when the inbound China opportunities return. This week, we're taking a look at the international education sector and how universities and education providers work to welcome international students and make their time studying in Australia as rewarding as possible for them and the Australian communities they live in. Along with tourism, the international education sector has been one of the hardest hit by the coronavirus, with many students impacted by border closures and forced to study entirely online. Additionally, there's also been claims of racism experienced by Chinese students in Australia. In today's session, we'll look to discuss strategies applied in the sector to ensure Chinese students are made to feel welcome during their time here and the often overlooked benefits they bring to Australian communities. We'll first hear from Dari Milani from the University of Newcastle on how the sector's faring in light of the impact of COVID-19, recent visa changes by the federal government, and how the sector works to engage international students. We'll then speak to Angela Lehman from the Lygon group to get a sense of the flow-on benefits that Chinese students bring to Australian communities and the economy more broadly. We'll then hear about the Australia Welcomes You campaign from Sally Sitou from the China-Australia Forum, who'll be sitting in for Jason Lee, who unfortunately could not make it today, and Catriona Jackson from Universities Australia also sends her apologies for being unable to make the session. However, this will just give us more time for our Q&A section at the second half of the hour. And if you have a look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. At any time in today's session, feel free to write a brief question that I'll then be moderating and sharing with our panelists in the second half of the hour. And I should also let you know that we're recording today's session, and you'll receive an email next week of that recording when it goes up on the ACBC website. Now, our first speaker, Dari Milani, was appointed the Executive Director, International and Partnerships, Global Engagement and Partnership Division at the University of Newcastle in May 2016. In this position, Dari leads the UON Global Business Unit and is responsible for the delivery of international student engagement, mobility and sponsorships, international admissions, business development and transnational education. In 2018, Dari was appointed Interim Pro Vice Chancellor, Global Engagement and Partnerships of the university and held the position until May 2019. In this interim role, Dari was responsible for the overall vision and strategic direction of sector-leading internationalization and advancement services, contributing to the achievement of the university's vision by 2025 through strategic leadership in alumni engagement, community and global engagement, institutional partnerships and reputation, student mobility, and philanthropy across the university. Dari, thanks a lot for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks so much, James, and thank you for the very generous introduction. It's really wonderful to be here talking today about the sector, talking about some of the challenges we face in these extraordinary times, and talking a little bit about what we've done in a regional context at the University of Newcastle to support our international students, but particularly our Chinese students. I'm going to talk through some examples of that. So I suppose we should talk about COVID-19 and what an extraordinary year this has been. But don't forget, before we had COVID-19 impacting all economies, we had the bushfires in Australia impacting international tourism, domestic tourism, and of course the international education sector. So it feels really like we've been on emergency footing since January. And we're now at the end of July and we're still essentially in this holding pattern as a country on what we're doing around international visitors. So, look, I think for most institutions, what we saw initially with COVID-19 was a very quick pivot to online education. And that was a really interesting learning for most institutions. Universities are not particularly renowned for being quick, agile institutions, but the way that most universities in the sector pivoted so quickly really helped students transition to online learning. And of course, we've seen mixed results with online learning. There's still a lot of merit in the delivery of online, but some questions perhaps around value for money for online. And we know with international students, a large reason for them coming to study in Australia is not just the degree that they're getting, but it's the international experience they have when they arrive. So online learning at the moment doesn't deliver that, but we're looking to really make sure that students are engaged, students really maximize this opportunity while they have very little options in terms of what they do now, in terms of deferring studies, continuing studies. The situation has extended far longer than we expected, and it's unclear how long it will go on for. So as an institution, as a sector, we're focused on delivering the best possible experience online. And we've seen some really fantastic collaboration and engagement across the world, and China's no different, with the Ministry of Education in China really engaging in online learning in a way that perhaps we haven't before. So that's really encouraging. So at the moment, we have a lot of students studying online offshore and waiting for the opportunity to come back to Australia once the borders open. So many of you would have heard about pilot programs that were in train to bring international students back, particularly continuing students. So those students who'd already commenced their degrees, those students who had critical work placement elements of their degrees that they needed to complete. There were pilot programs led by each state, but all of those pilots at this stage are on hold, perhaps with the exception of the Northern Territory, where there might be an opportunity to proceed those pilots. So the holding pattern for the sector right now is online education continues for students who are offshore, but students who are onshore, many universities, and the University of Newcastle is one such example, are transitioning back to face-to-face studies for onshore students. And that will commence for us in August. However, if there's one thing we've learned from what's happened in Victoria recently, is you can never make plans too far in advance, because very quickly they can be changed as the situation changes. Then the other piece is around government engagement, and we've seen state governments engaging in very different ways around international student support. And there's some really great examples of best practice across the country. And there's been some states where we've, I think as a sector, been a little disappointed that they haven't come out sooner. However, at this point, all states are providing support for international students. Most institutions have hardship funds. The University of Newcastle has a significant hardship fund for international students to access. And we're really happy to say that as a community here in Newcastle, we've really rallied around international students who are here in Australia, who need our support. Maybe they've lost work opportunities, or maybe they're suffering from anxiety around the situation. So we've really come together as a community. There's a great example actually of a healthcare provider, NIB, who is based in this community and doing some really fantastic things, making sure international students all across Newcastle have access to health supplies, essential health supplies. So as a community, we've really come together. But there is a reason for that. We are a university, we are the only university in Newcastle. So we are very fortunate in that our connections with our community are very strong. I'm actually from London originally. I moved out to Australia in 2004, and I spent most of my career in Sydney. before I moved to Newcastle in 2016. And it's very interesting, being a Londoner, being very familiar with a multicultural society, and then moving to Sydney and seeing a very similar kind of makeup of society. It was very interesting to move to Newcastle, where perhaps you don't have as much of a multicultural layer through society. And I was certainly very nervous about what that meant, especially in my role, which is to attract international students to the region. But what I found it actually meant is, as a community in Newcastle, the community is very proud of international students. They're very proud that students have chosen to study in Newcastle rather than anywhere else in the world. So it makes them quite special and valued by the community, which is really interesting because it opens up a lot of opportunities for our students to engage with the community in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have in cities like London, where I'm from, where if you're an international visitor, you're one of many. Whereas if you're an international visitor here, you're someone very special and someone that we really want to engage with and make sure you have the best possible experience. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have here in Newcastle. As I said, we're not necessarily a multicultural society yet. We have that will to engage with international visitors, and partly that is driven by the tourism sector. So for those of you who know the region well, we have Port Stephens to the north, which is an international destination for whale watching, dolphin watching. We have the Hunter Valley, where I'm sure you're familiar with the wonderful wines and produce that comes out of the Hunter Valley. And we have the city of Newcastle, which is developing in its own right as a tourism destination. So we're perfectly placed for international visitors, but we struggle with some things which are quite distinct. So if you consider Sydney for a moment and you look at the census data for Sydney, what you'd find is that if you looked at ancestry, so how people have defined their ancestry, top 5, you will find China. In fact, China is number 3, with 7.8% of the population identifying their ancestry as Chinese. And that's not to say, if we did country of birth, it's even higher. So country of birth, China would be number 2 in the census data for Sydney. If you look at Melbourne, it's a similar story. So Chinese ancestry, 6.1%, top 5, and then country of birth for China is, for Melbourne is number 2 after India. But Newcastle isn't like that. If you look at the census data for Newcastle, you'll find that actually China doesn't make the top 5 at all for ancestry. We have Australian, English, Scottish, Irish, and German, which speaks really to the industries of the region. And then for country of birth, we don't have that first generation immigration at scale from China yet in this region. So China doesn't make the top 5, but I expect in the coming years it will. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because I said that Newcastle is really trying to position itself as a destination, an international tourism destination. And to do that, you need to attract visitors from all around the world. And we know that the largest visitor group in Australia is Chinese tourists. It's a huge part of our tourism sector. And those Chinese tourists tend to go to Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. In fact, those are the top 3 destinations. So how do we attract Chinese tourists to Newcastle? This is the question that the community in the sector is grappling with, the tourism sector. Well, one way to do that is to increase that capability that we take for granted in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, where you have high Chinese capability and competency, versus a region where you have very little because of immigration, historical immigration, and you use the international students to really help and support our community. And this is a really different way of looking at the value of international students. I think a lot of the time as a sector, we think about what we can give international students. And they do have a fantastic opportunity for a world-class education in Australia, no doubt about it. They have a fantastic opportunity to experience living in another country. And they have a fantastic opportunity to meet people from all around the world. But there's also an opportunity for our communities. And in Newcastle, we've really focused on this, what our students can give back to our communities. So what we've done is create a work integrated learning program. So this is essentially an internship opportunity where students will be able to work with small to medium-sized businesses in the region. And I'm just putting up a screen here. I hope you can see this. Students will be able to work with small to medium-sized enterprises in the region and help them increase their China capability, understand how to do business with China. And it's been a really fantastic program so far. We've had so much support from the community. In fact, when we first thought of this program, the idea behind the name Connect 88 was that we were going to find 88 internships for students. 8 being an auspicious number, obviously, in many cultures, including Chinese culture. But what we found after talking to businesses in the region was the demand was so high, actually we needed to reset our goals, and we thought we could deliver 88 companies who would provide multiple internships to our students. But the kind of work that our students have been doing are things that only Chinese students can do in this community. So helping businesses set up WeChat accounts, helping businesses really understand what it is a Chinese tourist, what it is a Chinese consumer is looking for. And this has really helped industries like the wine industry. There's been some fantastic examples of winemakers who've got a long history of engaging in China, and I'm not sure people might be familiar with Tamberlane wines, organic wines in the Hunter Valley. They actually do fantastic programs where they will do cellar tours in Chinese. They will have a lot of their collateral and information about winemaking in Chinese for visitors. But there's a lot of smaller vineyards and winemakers who are getting Chinese visitors, but they're not really clear on how to fully engage with them. So our students are really helping in that sense and helping those businesses build up their capabilities. And we've done this, in 3 phases. The first phase is ensuring there is a skills match for the student and ensuring there is structure around the placement. It isn't just an opportunity for Chinese students to learn about the workplace in Australia. It is something very structured with clear outcomes for businesses to benefit from Chinese students. And of course, it's a virtuous circle, because once that happens, the value of these students increases. Businesses start to see the opportunities with Chinese students and employing them once they graduate. They have the opportunities to work for these companies for 3 years after they graduate, and it is invaluable experience. And we've been very fortunate in that we have some high-profile partnerships with Alibaba, with the China Week Business Forum in this community. But we've also got some fantastic other partners like Newcastle Tourism Industry Group, who is supporting this project. NIB, as I mentioned before, a provider from this region supporting this project, and actually Didi. And if you think about that example for a moment, that one is really interesting. So a student who comes to Newcastle and does this Connect 88 program, all of a sudden has access to the largest ride-sharing platform in the world, access that they wouldn't get in China necessarily, but they can get it here in Newcastle. It's quite extraordinary, really. So this program has really been an example of where we're looking to use our community. We're looking to use the fact that we are a smaller city, the fact that we have access to businesses, and really supporting students to give them extra value through their experience here. And I think that's going to be a trend in the future. As we see what happens with student behaviour post-COVID, and we see how much time they will spend in Australia versus in their own country, either studying online or at a learning centre, it will mean that the time that they are in Australia has to really be maximised. It needs to be really, really valuable and worthwhile experiences. So that's the kind of thing we're doing with this program, and we think it's, well, we know it's been very successful, but we're really excited to get more partners onto this program and get more students onto this program. So that's the end of my session, but I'm really looking forward to answering questions that you may have at the end of the session and participating in the discussion as we go on. So thank you, James.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Dari. So great to hear about that Connect 88 program. Especially, I love the fact that it really promotes the Chinese of international students. I know at ACBC, you know, we have 800-900 members, and it's such a need for these Australian businesses to have Chinese proficient people in their organisations, and there's always been a look to link with job opportunities with international students in Australia, with the Australian businesses that need that China capacity. And it sounds like Connect 88 really goes a long way towards that. So if anyone has any questions for Dari, please ask them in the Q&A section that we'll come to after we speak to all of our panelists. Our second speaker, Angela Lehman, has had a rich and varied career in research, policy and analysis in Australia, China and the UK. Angela has been a lecturer in sociology at the ANU and an assistant professor at Xiamen University, China, and holds adjunct and honorary appointments at each. She's a China expert and worked as international policy analyst at Universities Australia in 2017 and 2018, and has worked as a researcher at Matrix Evidence in London, developing policy analysis for the British government. And she has been a leader in major research projects at the Regional Australia Institute. Angela, thanks a lot for joining us today, and it's over to you.
I will remember to unmute myself. Thanks so much, James, and thank you. And I was really, that was fantastic to hear from Dari, and I think a lot of what I've got to say today actually really resonates with what Dari has said. So I think there will be some common threads that we can pull out. I'll just share my screen here. If I can figure that out, there we go. Okay, so I want to begin today by thinking a little bit about who Chinese students are. I thought what I could do in my very brief amount of time is have a think about, firstly, just digging down and having a think about who are these students that come to Australia from China, and just have a little bit of a think about the diversity in that group and what that could mean for the way that businesses and services can connect with Chinese international students. I want to have a little think a little bit about who the stakeholders are. So who are the primary industries and services in Australia that might touch on an international student's life while they are here? And we've heard a little bit about the tourism sector already from Dari, and I just thought we could spend a bit of time having a bit of a brainstorm through that. And then if I've got time, I would like to actually have a little zoom down into the tourism industry to really try to pull out some of those connections between international higher education and Chinese international students and Australia's tourism industry. So it's a lot to cover. So I might not get through it all. If I don't get through it all, then I'm happy to share my slides and answer any questions during question time also. These are just a few quick slides before we go, just to kind of have a look at where we are now. Obviously, the commencements are down. This is unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in. And I won't go into the data too much in terms of student commencements and enrolments and things now, except to flag that that things are down. We can see here, this is data that was taken in March this year, and in March this year is actually, you know, it was quite a different time. This year has been a very long year, but in March this year, we had 38% of Chinese international students in Australian universities were outside of Australia. So because of the timing of what has happened, we had a lot of Chinese students who were outside of Australia at that time and could not get back in. I suspect that 38% is higher than that now, as some students have managed to find their way back to China since March. So we're dealing with two different groups of students here. We're dealing with our international students that are here, and that still is a large number of students that are in Australia and are going through COVID with us, and they definitely require support, and also they are still consuming, and they're still part of our communities and societies too, and there's definitely attention that needs to be placed there. And also the group of students, the large group of students that are currently offshore, but are connected to Australia via their university, and the students that we hope will be able to and be wanting to come back to Australia once those doors open again. So I thought what I could do today is really have a look at this diversity of students. And the reason I'd like to talk about that is because I think we often hear about Chinese international students as if they're one big homogenous group of people. And I just think this is a moment during COVID where we can just kind of stop and pause a bit and think about what is this group of people and what do they look like, and therefore what does it mean for the way that we approach welcoming them and making sure that they're having the best opportunities here, but also finding opportunities to build services and products that might suit them. So in terms of age groups, I think it's really interesting to know that there's actually 2,600 or so Chinese international students who are children. They're under the age of 18 and they live in Australia. So we actually have, you know, this cohort of very young students who are in our secondary schools here in Australia, and they're sent here usually around the age of 15 or so, and they sometimes transition through to Australian universities. We also have a group of students who are maybe 17, 18 years old, so they're students. Sometimes parents will choose to send their child abroad in about the equivalent of year 11, so that they don't have to sit this infamous and very difficult Gaokao examination. So they will come here and they will go to a pathways college and then transition into a university. We have students who will come here straight from school, so they'll finish their Gaokao and come in. These are students who have spent the last years of their life studying very hard usually. So you know, this is the first thing that they've done after that incredibly pressurized situation. So that's like 17, 18-year-old people. Then we have a slightly older age group, which is like your 20 to 25 or so, who may have come, you know, in the middle of a bachelor degree where there's a pathways between, they might have a partnership with a Chinese institution and an Australian institution. So they'll sit half of their course in China and then come to Australia. We also have a large cohort of master's students, and the master's students might have just finished their bachelor's degree, or they may have actually worked professionally for a few years before they come here. So we have some Chinese PhD students. This number is smaller for our Chinese cohort than for other nations, but we do have a percentage of them here. And we also, that's the other point I wanted to make, is that we don't often see mature age students from China. It's not as common of a thing to do in China as it is in other countries. So my point about age group is this is a really young group of people. We're dealing with people between the ages of about 15 through to about the ages of 26, 27 primarily. And I think that's something that's interesting for us to keep in mind when we're welcoming people into our country. In terms of family background, given that these students must pay a fairly high fee to come to Australia to study, we can expect that most of these people come from the middle classes or the elite part of society in China. However, the term middle class in China is a very long spectrum, and there's a lot of diversity within that group of people. You may have students whose parents have been working in a business full time and have both of them working and have saved enough to send their child to Australia, or you may actually have people who come from quite a wealthy professional background or senior high officials and so forth. So there's a lot of diversity within that spectrum of middle class and the experiences that our students might have had before they come here. Gender, Chinese government data says that 60% of the students leaving China to study abroad globally are female, and our data reflects that. We have about 58% or so of our Chinese international students are female. So we're seeing that we've got a very young and a little bit more feminized cohort of people here as well. In terms of ethnicity, most of our Chinese international students will come from the Han ethnicity, as this is the majority ethnicity in China, but we do have people in Australia studying who come from one of the other 55 ethnic minority groups in China. So these people, while all Chinese international students will speak Mandarin, as this is the official language of China, there is also sections of this group that will also speak another language, a second language or a regional dialect, and follow different cultural and religious traditions. And that's also something that's quite interesting to keep in mind. Academic ability, I won't go into this today because I've got other things to go through, but this is something that is actually really interesting. Like you hear, why are some Chinese international students like excel at university here in Australia and some kind of struggle? And I think there are reasons. There are cultural, political and socioeconomic reasons for that I'm happy to talk about another time if you'd like. Right. I thought I'd have a quick word about how Chinese international students communicate with each other when they come to Australia. When a Chinese international student gets here, how do they find information? This could be information about where to live, where to stay, where to eat, where to shop, all of these basic day-to-day activities, or where to travel to, for example. And the answer is that they find this information through each other. Peer-to-peer support is the primary way that Chinese international students are really finding and accessing support. Now, we know that universities and government departments go to great lengths to provide information to international students, and this is of varying quality, but there's a lot of effort that goes into that. However, the primary way that students are actually getting that data, getting that information, is often through asking each other and asking people, other Chinese students who have been here for a longer time, or engaging with Chinese communities who are already here. And the mechanism via which they do this is, of course, WeChat. And I won't go into WeChat too much because I think James has done some other work on this before. But I just wanted to raise this briefly now, because as we know, WeChat is the mega super app that everyone in China, or it's the most popular app in China. Students are using this app daily before they even consider coming to Australia to study. So this is just a continuation of a behaviour that is part of their daily life as a young person in China. So when they get here, the services that they're accessing via WeChat, even though WeChat is a Chinese government kind of administered application, there are many Chinese, local Australian public accounts here in Australia, which are often administered and run via members of the Chinese Australian community. And some of these accounts are aimed at the Chinese international student community, giving them information about where to go, where to eat, where to shop, and so forth. And also news and information about maybe right now about COVID and safety, security, these kinds of things. Sometimes Chinese international students may even write for these apps, these programs, and so forth. So this presents a really unique kind of, I think, challenge for a lot of us in Australia, that this ecosystem of information can be seen as being kind of hard to penetrate a little bit. But this is where, and I think, it goes to something Darry was talking about earlier, is engaging with Chinese international students to assist and to help to break that barrier can be something that has a lot of potential going forward as well. Okay. Now, I wanted to have a little look at my bubbles here. In the green bubble here, this is our student, and they've come here to Australia facilitated by their educational institution, and that's the green circle here that I've popped around that student. I wanted to have a think about all the other kinds of sectors and industries that may impact on may sell to, may profit from, may benefit the international student. And there are many, many of them. I've only just popped a few of them here. Particularly tourism, which we've mentioned before, but also hospitality and retail are very integrated into everybody's life, really. But I mean, we know that international students are engaged with sectors in an interesting way because they often work in these sectors as well as consume in these sectors. Also accommodation and retail, real estate, health services, sports and leisure. Entrepreneurialism, I've popped that in there because I read an interesting study this week that in the UK, they've found that 60% of university startups have an international student involved with them. And that the majority of those international students are actually Chinese. So there's this really interesting kind of innovation group, I think, within the Chinese international student community, which could be very interesting to work with and to engage with. Volunteering, some of the research that I've been doing since the beginning of COVID with international students has shown that there is a real desire to integrate and to become a part of a community and to contribute to communities in Australia. This is for a few reasons, because of the desire for cultural interaction, for understanding Australian communities, but it's also a little bit quite pragmatic as well, in that a lot of our Chinese students that I mentioned before have come straight out of school. A 20-year-old Chinese student's CV looks very different to an Australian 20-year-old CV. They often don't have the extracurriculars and the work experience, and they're trying to build up their experience really in the workplace in order to help them sometime in the future, as a lot of young people do. So there's just some thoughts, and I thought, you know, it could be worthwhile, I think, as we're thinking about how to welcome Chinese international students in Australia, is to really think about all of these other sectors and to try to think about where the collaboration points lie and where the synergies lie and what different parts of Australian economies and communities are trying to achieve or could potentially achieve with Chinese international students. My red circles here, I don't know if you can see them the way that the slide is sitting there on the screen, but I wanted to flag that once this circle, this student here leaves its green bubble and goes back to China, the benefits and the potential for Chinese international students does not end. We have the potential for soft power, for example. We have the potential for brand ambassadors, for someone going back to China, talking about your wine, talking about your region and your community. And we hope, I think we would all hope that when a Chinese student left Australia, that one of the thoughts in their minds might be, I hope I can come back one day and show some people. So there is that return economy that we're aiming for. Now, I don't know where I am for time. I've kind of haven't been keeping track, so give me a little wave if I'm going over.
Yeah, so I'd say, Angela, maybe 2 to 3 more minutes, if that's okay.
No worries. I'll just do a little bit of quick tourism data, because it kind of links into what Dari said, and then we can finish up.
No worries.
Okay, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, maybe if I go back to here and we look at, one of these sectors here, which is the tourism sector, and just have a zoom down into that and have a look at the integration and the interaction between international higher education and tourism, which I don't think is really spoken about enough in this country, considering these are two of our most important service exports. This is just a graph to show something I'm sure most of us are aware of, that the growth of Chinese short-term visitors has been quite rapid over the last 10 years. And in 2016, it kind of just pipped New Zealand to become the largest percentage of short-term visitors in our country. Now, this, if you mapped, and I don't have it here now, but if you mapped the growth of Chinese students in our universities and education systems at the same time, it would probably be a very similar line. Without education, tourism weakens. Now, a lot of those, the problem with the way we collect tourism data and education data is they're collected rather separately. So we do have some crossover, which maybe confuses the data sometimes. So short-term visitors, the ones that on that graph I just showed you, are people who are coming to Australia for less than a year. And they may have ticked a box on their form, their visitor survey, that says that they're coming for education-related purposes. Now, we know that 16% of Chinese short-term visitors to Australia are coming for education. This is not our long-term students, not our people studying bachelor's degrees. These are people coming just for a short-term visit, but they're coming for education. They might be coming for an English language course, for a pathways course, or some other kind of non-award course. So 16% of Chinese short-term visitors come to Australia for education. And this group makes up 65% of the share of spend for short-term visitors in Australia. So in other words, these are a very lucrative market of people coming to Australia for a short term through and instigated by the education sector, and that they spend. And the reason they spend a lot more is often because they stay a lot longer. This graph here is showing something similar, basically showing that we have 15% of our short-term visitors from China, and they spend 27% of the spend here when they're in the country. So they spend a lot more than the Kiwis, for example. I'll skip through that. This is a little graph just to kind of maybe flip onto what Barry was saying about regional Australia and some of the benefits that can come from that. The blue spots, the spots are where Chinese international students live. Orange spots are kind of, smaller populations. But I wanted to highlight that, yes, there are actually parts of Australia where we've got opportunities here to really promote the region and to really engage with Chinese international students in interesting ways. I'll finish up there, I guess. I can talk about COVID maybe in question time if people have any questions about that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that, Angela. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions for Angela, please ask them in the Q&A box. So I think we've already spoken today, obviously, about COVID-19, and Dari mentioned the bushfires. And I'd say maybe one of the third challenge that we've really faced this year is the general bilateral relationship between Australia and China. That's also flowed onto Chinese student sentiment and experience in Australia. So it's great to have Sally Sitou join us today to talk about the Australia Welcomes You campaign. Sally is a committee member of the Chinese Australian Forum and one of the organisers of the Australia Welcomes You campaign. She's the International Media Advisor for the University of Sydney, and prior to that, she worked as a Media and Communications Manager for AusAid in Samoa and as a Media and Policy Advisor for Federal MP Jason Clare. In 2018, she worked in Beijing as an Australian Youth Ambassador for Development at Community Alliance, a not-for-profit grassroots organisation which supports the elderly in China. Sally joins us today in the place of Jason Lee, and thanks a lot for joining us at such late notice, Sally.
Thanks, James. Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen now. And Jason does apologise. He was hoping to make it. But one of the things that we're doing at the Chinese Australian Forum is we're running what I like to think is a simple campaign with a simple message, but perhaps in a complicated environment. And I think everyone listening to this panel discussion is well aware of the complexity of the environment that we're in at the moment. We're at a situation where the geopolitical tension between Australia and China has been ratcheting up for a number of years. There is a kind of slanging match between the two governments, and they're both issuing travel warnings to their citizens. We're in a time when there is, frankly, an increase in racism towards Asian Australians on our streets. But also, we're going through the worst recession that we've seen in 70 years. And then on top of that, a global pandemic. So we are well aware of the challenges and the complexities that we're all facing at the moment. But in amongst that, we wanted to create this campaign to deliver a simple and punchy message. I think, the difficulty at the moment is not lost on the forum at all. And there were long debates about whether or not we should go ahead with this campaign, whether or not we should dip our toe into this area, because the Chinese Australian Forum has existed for 30 years now, and the primary aim of it has been to fight racism in Australia. Now we're stepping into a tricky time and potentially quite challenging geopolitical tensions. There was some fierce debate amongst our members about whether or not this was the right campaign to run. But we wanted to do it because there were two things that, the 2 points that we thought were critical that we get across during this campaign. And one is that the relationship we have with the Chinese people is one that is long. It's grounded in generations of friendship and family, and is one that is built on mutual respect. And I think sometimes that discussion can get lost, especially when we talk about the economic value of China and the students and the tourists, is that it is one that is deeply personal as well. So that's one key point that we wanted to make with this campaign. The other one is probably a little bit more distant, but I think just as important, and that is to remind us all about the core values of what Australia stands for. Yes, there have been incidences of racism, and you know, a lot of the media reports have shown that, and in fact, the Chinese Australian Forum recently ran a campaign called Unity Over Fear, where we really wanted to drive home the message that we don't stand for that sort of racist behaviour and vilification on the streets. And we launched a petition where we wanted to galvanise people and get them together to say that we're choosing unity over fear during this time of, you know, intense concern about the pandemic. And we're really pleased to have received over 100,000 signatures on that petition, and have had 30 community organisations support it. So we do recognise that there has been an increase in racism on the streets, but what we want to do with this campaign is to talk about the fundamentals of this country, the values that we all share, that we are fundamentally a multicultural society that is warm, hospitable, welcoming and friendly. So those are the two aims of the campaign. And we're really trying to leverage what Angela pointed out earlier, was that most of the students and tourists and people in China are really all about the digital at the moment. So this campaign is a social media campaign that we're running. The hashtag is Australia Welcomes You, and in Chinese, 澳洲欢迎你. And we want people to really share this message on their own social media channels, through WeChat, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we're really pleased that, so this is the kind of look and feel of the campaign. As you can see, it's quite rustic. It's not a Tourism Australia ad. We're really asking people to make this really grassroots campaign that says Australians welcome you. And we're really fortunate to have the support of the Australia-China Business Council, the University of Sydney, UNSW, UTS, and Dari, I'll hit you up. We'd love to get the University of Newcastle on board. We've got Accor Hotels, Austrade. So we've got some major organisations coming on board, and some tourism operators, which is fantastic. And we'd love to add to that list. But really what we're looking for is for Lao Bai Sing to get involved, you know, everyday Australian, to really send home the message that Australians here, when the travel bans are lifted and when people can come into this country, that they will be welcomed. And so that's that's what the message is. We launched a week and a bit ago. We've had some good pickup already in some of our media outlets. The Sydney Morning Herald, China Daily, a few other Chinese media outlets have reported on the story. The New York Times there is a bit aspirational for us. We're hoping to get in there. But we'd really like this message to spread as widely as we can. So it'd be great if anyone listening in would like their organisation to get on board. We've got some simple collateral that we can send you, but really it's just a message on a piece of paper and a photo. And as you can see, a photo with your dog works, and in front of some iconic Australian landscapes would be fantastic as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Sally. So any of that collateral, I'll be sending out in the event debrief that I'll send out with the recording of today's session. Sally, I'll stop sharing your screen there. But I really like that point about, the Chinese community in Australia is so far-reaching and it's such a long existing community. But I think the way we've approached in Australia is just quite passively. The fact that, this community is just there and we just, let it kind of happen in the background. Dari, what I really liked about the Connect 88 campaign was how it really activates this positive benefit that the Chinese international community brings to, universities and Australian life more general. As someone who works at a university, I just wanted to ask, by giving a Chinese student such a positive experience in Australia, how vital is word of mouth in terms of getting, successor students to come in? So compared with other tools that a university might consider for their marketing of a degree, where does word of mouth sit there when a Chinese student has a positive experience in Australia and then might go back and tell a cousin or a brother or a friend about, their experience here?
Oh, look, I think it's absolutely crucial, James. It's something that we've always known about, is a factor in why students make the decision on their study destination. But what we've seen over the last, I suppose, 5 to 10 years is actually prospective students, when they're in their country, they already know a lot more than they used to know about the place they're going to, the country they're going to study in, the institution they're going to study in or they would like to study in. It's very different to when I started in this industry, where actually a lot of international students didn't know very much at all about Australia, and they would rely on education agents to help them navigate that. These days, our agents are telling us that the students come in already knowing so much about the institution, about the country, and that decision tipping point is that recommendation, is, what was the experience of, friends and family who studied in Newcastle? What was that like? So I think it's always been a factor, but it's now more so than ever as students have so much information at their fingertips.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Dari. Angela, the first question I have is from Jessica. Hi, Angela. I teach etiquette and have a course for Chinese people to learn Western etiquette. Could I have a talk to you about promoting this to Chinese students, as I think it would fit in very well with what you said. So look, I'll let you guys connect after the call. But I just wanted to ask Angela, to what extent do you feel like Western etiquette is something that is required on Chinese students when they, arrive in Australia, as opposed to, maybe something that they might automatically, develop?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy to speak to the question. Ask at any time. I'm happy to be put in touch. I think the etiquette. I think what's more important than etiquette, or what we call etiquette, is an understanding of the different kind of culture, a bit more of an awareness in Australia of the different cultural contexts that Chinese students might come from. And for me, as someone that's come out of academia and into the policy space, I've noticed like the way that Chinese students learn and the way that they communicate with professors or with other people in their institution is very, very different. And that can cause some problems when students come to Australia. For example, Chinese students are often not very familiar with or used to using email, for example. It's just not something that is very commonly done in China, that most of their information is received via other means. So Chinese students sometimes might have trouble, for example, writing an email, which is a very important skill set for a student or a work person, or a colleague or something in Australia. So I think it's sometimes understanding some of these cultural differences and why they are the way they are. Yeah, and I think it is important. I think if, you know, in terms of building careers and employability skills, it's important, but it's also important for Australian students to be understanding how people in other societies do things differently and why. And I think that's another side of international higher ed that brings benefit to Australia as well.
Great. Okay, well, look, we're coming up on 3 o'clock, but I think I might just extend the session for another 5 minutes. If any of the attendees need to run off, you will be emailed with a recording of the session next week. Angela, we also have a question, well, more a comment on boarding schools, about how boarding schools kind of market in China, and how the students that proceed go on to Australian universities and tend to be more culturally aware than undergrads who come straight to university. I was wondering if you could make a comment on how, you know, the different types of Chinese students coalesce at the university level, where you might have students who have studied in a high school in Australia and a boarding school, because you did mention that there's Chinese communities in the international education sector. I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on how these all kind of come together when they do arrive at the university level.
I think that's a really good point. And, you know, when these students come to Australia, they've often come from very different secondary school, you know, they may have come from quite different secondary school backgrounds. So in China, they may have attended, you know, a regular kind of public school, or they may have gone to a private boarding school or an independent school, or indeed like an international school where they've been learning primarily in English. Or you've got this cohort that I mentioned earlier of students that have come to Australia for secondary school. So bringing these students together in Australia, they may be meeting each other and quite different groups of people in universities for the first time. And I think that's why, you know, we have an opportunity here to make sure that we don't stigmatize and overgeneralize Chinese students, particularly in the media. A lot of, you know, we've got people coming into the country with varying degrees of willingness to experience new ideas and to engage with Australia. And there's been a really important study out this week by, a few weeks ago actually, sorry, I think it was Stanford University, but I might be corrected, they've done some research about the effect of xenophobia and racist attacks or incidents on Chinese international students actually heading more conservatively and back towards, you know, kind of support for quite closed values. So racism and xenophobia has a real impact on what we're trying to achieve in international higher education. I don't know how I've gotten there, but I think it's interesting to note that bringing people together from different backgrounds can have a positive effect or a negative effect.
Dari, probably have a question for you here. Do you see more opportunities for transnational programs given the current situation around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're going to see post-COVID is education delivery is going to look different. And it's not necessarily going to be because institutions want it to look different. It's going to be because students are going to demand it's different. They're going to want more flexibility and more choice. And part of that is absolutely transnational education and being able to take part of their education program, whether that's English language or their pathway or their degree, in their country or in another country, take part of it online and then define what that in-country experience is going to be for them. And that's where I talked a little bit before about it's so important to ensure that when the students come to Australia, they have a really high value experience. There needs to be programs which, you know, helps with this two-way cultural exchange, adds genuine, work experience, opportunities to their international experience. I think that's the way it's all going to look. So transnational is definitely part of what the future is going to look like for all institutions, no doubt about it.
Okay, great. Well, look, I might just ask one final question before we finish off for the session. Let's look forward 12 months' time, and let's hope that, there's been a vaccine discovered for the coronavirus, and that, the borders can reopen and we can begin people-to-people exchanges, as we've been doing for the last few decades. What do you think, probably Angela and Dari, what do you think the educational international sector is going to look like? I guess at the moment we have, a proportion for the UK, a proportion for Australia, a proportion for the USA. Do you think once we kind of start up again with the international education exchanges, that we'll see similar proportions, or do you think there's an opportunity where in 12 months' time we can see a complete revolution in terms of where Chinese students are going to choose to go, once borders reopen? So I guess my question is, do you think we'll see a similar proportional trend that we've been seeing in the last 10 years, or do you think the next 12 months could be an opportunity to really leapfrog, from an Australian perspective in receiving a larger Chinese cohort?
Do you want to go first, Dari, or I don't mind.
I can start this, Angela, but maybe you'll need to share your thoughts as well. Look, I think what I spoke about just now, the choice that students have is going to be very important, and institutions ensuring that they lay that choice in front of the students and let them build their own education journey. I think it's going to be less scripted by the institutions. So I don't know that we'll have the same, necessarily trends that we've had in the last 20 years. I still think international education in Australia is highly sought after. The quality is really, really strong. It's a unique story, actually, for Australia, the rise of international education. And the experiences that students have been overwhelmingly positive, throughout the sector. So look, I think students will want more choice. Students will want to build their own education journey. And whether that means there's more opportunity for Australian institutions, well, that really depends on how we react and how we engage in this different behaviour that we're undoubtedly going to see in future.
And from an international kind of policy perspective, it's a really interesting time right now, because we're seeing all of these major countries, destination countries such as the UK, Canada, and New Zealand and the USA, kind of implementing new policy changes to kind of try to protect their international higher education system post-COVID. And we've seen something very important happen in that space this week with the announcement of the suite of policy measures by the federal government, which were very, very welcomed by the sector. And these are moves, these kind of policy decisions are going to have actually a really, I think, important impact on how well we do recover. The other thing working in our favour in Australia, I hope, and it's fragile ground, is of course the way that we've dealt with the public health emergency, and that's very important, and we're on a positive kind of footing there. However, I think we're going to be in a buyer's market. I think Chinese students are going to be looking across the world to see where is best for me. And I think there are emerging countries that are going to be interesting to look at, such as, some countries in Europe, such as Germany, and some Scandinavian countries are doing some really interesting work in terms of promoting themselves for international higher ed. And there's also a trend, I think, emerging towards intra-regional higher education. So you may see more Chinese students looking to Singapore, Malaysia, and Korea and things like that. But all in all, I think Australia is in a really strong position, and President Trump is definitely helping us with that as well a little bit.
Okay, well, we thank President Trump for helping the Australian international education sector. Sally, did you have one last comment?
Yeah, just a quick one. Just wanted to echo what Angela said, in the sense that, it is going to be a buyer's market, but I hope that the Australian governments and all levels of government really take this opportunity to really work with universities and high schools and other vocational education groups to give international students a complete package. You know, sometimes we get them in, get them to pay their course fees, and then get them to fend for themselves. Whereas I hope this means that we become hungry and we really work to get these international students here and we make them feel welcome here.
Okay, excellent. I think that's a really good sentiment to end on, Sally. Thanks for that. So I'd like to thank all my panelists today, Dari, Angela and Sally for joining us. My apologies to the attendees for running a little over time, but I did want to get as many questions in there towards the end. Just a reminder that I'll be sending out a debrief email next week where I'll have contact details for our panelists, any slides and any collateral as mentioned by Sally. So once again, thanks a lot to our speakers. I'm looking forward to a positive year in 2021 with international education in Australia, and I hope you have a great weekend. See you next time.